2026 is approaching its final third, and it is turning out to be a massive year for some of the world's biggest mega projects. This year, we are seeing billion-dollar bridges finally open to traffic, airports preparing to welcome their first passengers, record-breaking skyscrapers reaching completion, and completion of some of the most advanced railway links. From North America's critical infrastructure to China's fastest train ever, and from Europe's megatunnels to the most expensive museum in the Middle East. These are the most jaw-dropping mega projects of the year. So stay with us as we count down the biggest mega projects completing in 2026. In June 2026, one of the most important bridges in North America stood completely finished. 6 lanes of empty pavement stretched 1.5 miles across the Detroit River, connecting Detroit to Windsor, Ontario. An opening ceremony was scheduled for June 12th, but was canceled just 24 hours prior. The bridge, which should have been opened 6 months earlier, remained unused, while 2 countries argued over who controlled it. To understand how it got to that point, you have to go back. In 2024, Canada and the US traded more than $760 billion worth of goods, making them the second largest trade partners in the world. About 30% of these traded goods go through this narrow strip, making it the busiest land border crossing on the continent. For the last 96 years, the lion's share of cross-border traffic through this corridor uses the 1.4-mile-long Ambassador Bridge. Built in 1929, it remained the most critical piece of infrastructure between the 2 countries. However, despite its obvious utility, the bridge is no longer a dependable piece of infrastructure. It is privately owned by Detroit's Maroon family. Neither the US nor the Canadian government has any control over the movement across it. However, the problem has intensified over the years because of the aging structure of the bridge. The Ambassador Bridge is a 4-lane crossing, and with more than 10,000 truckers crossing the bridge every day, it became a potential choke point. But since it is privately owned, the government could not force an extension. With traffic increasing every year and congestion becoming commonplace, both Canada and the US were losing millions of dollars every week. Calls for an alternative crossing to replace or unburden the Ambassador Bridge had been growing louder since the 80s. The case for a second bridge was overwhelming, and still, it took decades of legal battles and political fights to get moving. Canada eventually agreed to pay for the entire thing. The final cost came to 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, funded entirely by Canadian taxpayers, to be repaid over decades through tolls. Construction began in 2018, stretching 1.5 miles across the Detroit River. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is the longest cable-stayed bridge in North America. Its main span alone runs 2,799 feet, with a tower on the Detroit side rising 722 feet, just 5 feet shorter than the tallest building in the city. 216 steel cables fan out from those towers to carry the deck, which sits 150 feet above the water to let cargo ships pass underneath. With 6 lanes of traffic and a separate path for pedestrians, it connects Interstate 75 in Detroit directly to Highway 401 in Windsor, Ontario. In June 2024, the 2 halves of the deck met in the middle of the river, and 2 ironworkers, 1 American and 1 Canadian, shook hands over the water. By the end of 2025, construction was 98% complete. The only part left was an official inauguration, but it never came. President Trump has spent most of his second term in a deepening trade dispute with Canada. He threatened to block the bridge from opening unless the US was fully compensated. For weeks, nobody would explain why no one was allowed to drive across the $6 billion finished structure. The deadlock finally broke in July. Canada agreed to share half of the bridge's net revenue with a US-controlled fund for the first 15 years, and to give the American government a role in certain toll decisions. With the money sorted, the bridge could open. On July 27, 2026, traffic finally started flowing. Gordie Howe's descendants were among the first to cross, fitting for a bridge named after the hockey legend who was born in Canada and spent his career with the Detroit Red Wings. Michigan's governor drove over in a Michigan-built Ford Mustang with the top down. a senator rode across on a motorcycle, and the Ambassador Bridge's near-century-long monopoly on the busiest trade route between the two countries was finally over. After 8 years of construction, 2 decades of planning, and one very public international standoff, the Gordie Howe International Bridge is open. The Gordie Howe Bridge took a decade and a public standoff to connect 2 cities across one river. On the other side of the world, China spent that same decade digging something far more audacious. Not a bridge across the water, but a brand new river carved into the earth. In September 2026, China opened the first canal it has built to the sea in more than 1,000 years. Not since the days of the ancient Grand Canal, dug by hand across dynasties, has the country carved a waterway on this scale. It's called the Pinglu Canal, and it runs 85 miles through the mountains of Guangxi in southern China, from an inland reservoir near Nanning down to the port of Qinzhou on the Beibu Gulf. The problem it solves is one of geography. Southwest China is landlocked and resource-rich, but for cargo coming down the Xinjiang River system, reaching the open ocean meant a punishing 560-kilometer detour east through the crowded ports of the Pearl River Delta around Guangzhou and Shenzhen. Every ton of goods from Guangxi, Yunnan, and Guizhou had to take the long way around. The Pinglu Canal cuts straight south through the watershed instead, carving a shortcut to the sea and slicing that journey by more than 500 kilometers. What used to be roughly a month at sea becomes a trip of about a week. The scale of the digging is staggering. Crews excavated over 340 million cubic meters of earth and rock to carve the channel, more material than was moved to build the Three Gorges Dam. Because the land rises 65 meters between the reservoir and the sea, the canal needs 3 enormous sets of locks at Madao, Qixi, and Qingnian to lift and lower ships along the route. Each set holds 2 chambers 300 meters long. The Madao lock is the largest water-saving inland ship lock in the world, engineered to recycle much of its water back into nearby reservoirs instead of dumping it downstream every time a vessel passes through. The finished canal can carry ships of up to 5,000 tons. It was built fast and it wasn't cheap. Construction started in August 2022, and the whole thing came together for around $10 billion, opening roughly 3 months ahead of its original schedule at the China ASEAN Expo in September 2026. Once fully running, it's expected to move close to 90 million tons of cargo a year and save the region more than $700 million annually in shipping costs. And China isn't stopping with one. The Pinglu Canal is the backbone of a much larger plan to reconnect the country's interior to the sea, and its success has already set off proposals for a wave of new canals linking the Yangtze, the Pearl, and the Yellow River systems. The first river-to-sea canal in 1,000 years may turn out to be the first of many. JFK is the busiest international gateway in the United States and the front door to New York for millions of travelers a year. But for a long time, it was a confusing sprawl of aging terminals that people dreaded. It handles 62 million passengers a year, but the infrastructure struggles to serve even half that volume comfortably. New York is now fixing that with the largest airport redevelopment in American history, a $19 billion teardown and rebuild of nearly the entire airport. The centerpiece is the new Terminal 1, and its numbers are staggering. At $9.5 billion, it is the most expensive terminal project in the country. It occupies the south side of the airport where 3 older terminals once stood before they were demolished to make room. When the full thing is finished in 2030, it will be the largest terminal in the United States. More than 20 international airlines plan to move in at that point. So what's happening in 2026? The first phase was supposed to open in June with 14 gates and a brand new arrivals and departures hall. It didn't make it. Delays in the electrical and mechanical systems have pushed the opening to November 2026 at the earliest. JFK's transformation goes beyond that one building. A separate $4.2 billion Terminal 6 is rising on the north side of the airport, with its own first gates opening in 2026. Terminals 4 and 8 have already been expanded and modernized. The old Terminal 2 closed in 2023, and Terminal 3 was demolished back in 2013. The whole airport is being reshaped from a scattered collection of small dated terminals into a smaller number of much larger modern ones. One important aspect of the JFK transformation is what it represents for New York's global competitiveness. For decades, cities like Dubai, Singapore, and Tokyo have built airport experiences that make JFK look like a bus terminal. The $19 billion investment is New York's effort to improve its position as a global gateway. For anyone flying through JFK in 2026, it means a year of moving parts, shifting gates, and construction detours. But when the dust finally settles, New York will have an airport that, for the first time in a long time, actually looks like it belongs to New York. JFK isn't the only aviation hub reaching a key milestone this year. In 2026, a new generation of mega airports is opening across 4 continents, starting with Australia, where an airport 40 years in the making is finally set to take flight. Western Sydney is one of the biggest economies in Australia. More than 2 million people live out here, around half of Sydney's entire population. However, for years, it did not have an airport of its own. The locals had to trek across the city to Kingsford Smith, the airport on the far eastern edge of Sydney, fighting through traffic the whole way. Kingsford Smith has its own problems. It sits boxed in by the city with no room to grow, and it shuts down every single night. A curfew stops flights between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., which means no late arrivals, no early departures, and no overnight freight. Sydney needed somewhere new, and it needed somewhere that could run 24 hours a day. The debate over where to put the new airport dragged on for decades. In 1986, after years of studies, the government announced Badgerys Creek in the western suburbs and started buying up the land, spending around $170 million acquiring the site between 1986 and 1991. Then in 1989, it changed its mind and decided to just add a 3rd runway at Kingsford Smith instead. And that became the pattern. A new government would revive the idea, study it, reaffirm Badgerys Creek, then shelve it again. The land the government had already bought sat there, frozen, with building restrictions keeping the surrounding area empty, waiting for an airport that never came. Finally, in 2012, a federal study concluded Badgerys Creek was clearly the best site for an airport. Construction began in September 2018, with the largest civil earth-moving job in Australia outside the mining industry. And after all those decades of dithering, the actual building went remarkably smoothly. By June 2025, the entire structure was finished, 7 months ahead of schedule, within its $5.3 billion Australian dollar budget. More than 2,000 workers put in around 9 million hours on a single terminal that handles domestic and international flights under one roof. The airport is formally named Nancy Bird Walton after the famous Australian aviator who became the youngest Australian woman to fly an aircraft at age 19. The first passenger flight at the new airport takes off on October 25, 2026. With a single 2.3-mile runway, the airport will handle up to 10 million passengers annually by 2033. With the eventual addition of the second runway, the site is designed to scale up to handle approximately 82 million passengers a year. A new metro line is being built to connect it to the rest of Sydney, part of an $18 billion government investment in the western half of the city. After half a century of arguments, Australia's biggest infrastructure project in a generation is finally real. Ho Chi Minh City has a problem that Sydney would recognize. Its airport, Tan Son Nhat, was built decades ago and is now running far beyond capacity, jammed into a city that has grown up around it with nowhere left to expand. Vietnam's answer lies about 25 miles east on former farmland in Dong Nai province, and it is the most expensive megaproject in the country's history. Long Than International Airport is enormous. The full site covers 4 times the size of London's Heathrow Airport. When all 4 of its construction phases are complete, it will handle 100 million passengers a year, putting it among the largest airports in the world. That construction is stretched out to 2035 with a total price tag north of $18 billion. For now, it is the first stage that finishes in 2026. Phase 1 alone costs around $4.6 billion. It delivers a single 2.5-mile runway, one massive passenger terminal, and the capacity to handle 25 million travelers and 1.2 million tons of cargo every year. That's already more than 5 times the traffic the old airport handled in 2024. The centerpiece is the terminal itself, a $1.3 billion structure designed in the shape of a lotus flower, Vietnam's national flower, meant to be unmistakable from the air. The site had been in Vietnam's national planning since 2005, but the project wasn't formally approved until 2015, and construction didn't begin until January 2021. The first runway hosted a ceremonial landing in December 2025 when a calibration flight touched down to test the new infrastructure. By early 2026, nearly 9,000 workers were on site with the target to host first flights by the end of the year. What Vietnam wants from all this goes beyond just relieving its old airport. It wants Long Than to become a regional hub. Right now, most of the connecting traffic flows through Singapore and Bangkok, two of the busiest hubs in Asia. Vietnam sits in a good geographic position to compete for some of that economic output. Long Than is Vietnam's bet to compete with aviation giants, especially after the addition of 3 more terminals and additional runways. There's one catch that could hold it back. The airport sits outside Ho Chi Minh City, and for now it's connected by a single expressway that's already prone to congestion. Rail links have been proposed, including a high-speed connection to the city, but none of them are built yet. Vietnam has managed to construct one of the biggest airports in the world. The infrastructure needed to actually reach it is still catching up, and until it does, Long Than's hub ambitions rest on a single crowded road. In July this year, India opened its newest airport for international traffic. Located in the Ulvi suburb of Raigad district, the Navi Mumbai International Airport will eventually handle 90 million passengers a year by 2032, making it the busiest airport in the country. The plans for a second airport in the Mumbai metropolitan region have been in motion since the late 1990s. After nearly 3 decades and at a cost of around $2.2 billion, it has finally opened its doors, relieving congestion in one of the most consequential economic corridors in the country. Spread across 1,160 hectares, the first phase took close to 4 years of active construction to complete and will be followed by 4 more phases running through 2032. Getting the site ready was a project in itself. The land was low and prone to flooding, with the Ulvi River running straight through it and a hill blocking part of the plot. Before any runway could be laid, crews rerouted the river, flattened the hill, and raised the entire site above the flood line. Only then could the airport take shape. Its terminal, designed in the form of a lotus, India's national flower, meant to be recognizable from the sky. Since the first domestic flights began in December 2025, the response has been immediate, with the airport quickly ramping up to more than 100 flights a day and moving to round-the-clock operations by February. What ties it all together is the Atal Setu, the 13-mile sea bridge across Mumbai Harbor. Opened in 2024, it connects South Mumbai to the new airport in about 30 minutes. Mumbai is now a 2-airport city, the two working side by side to share the load of one of the fastest-growing aviation markets in the world. From Asia's newest aviation hub, we move to Europe to a city where a mega project is redefining how people move around inside mega cities. Paris is in the middle of building the largest transport project in Europe, and on November 30th, 2026, the first piece of it opens to passengers. It's called the Grand Paris Express, and when it's finished, it will add more than 200 kilometers of brand new automated metro around the French capital, 4 new lines, 68 new stations, effectively doubling the size of the existing metro. The whole scheme carries a price tag north of 35 billion euros, making it one of the most expensive infrastructure programs anywhere on the continent. Line 18 is the first of the 4 new lines to carry passengers. The section opening in November runs across the Saclay Plateau south of the city, between Massy-Palaiseau and Christ de Saclay, and there's a reason they're starting there. Saclay is France's great bet on the future. a sprawling science and technology cluster often described as the country's answer to Silicon Valley, packed with universities, research labs, and companies. Tens of thousands of students, researchers, and workers pour onto that plateau every day, and until now, the only real way to reach it was by road. The new line changes that overnight. When the full line is done, it will run 35 kilometers from Orly Airport in the south all the way to Versailles, with 10 stations connecting the airport, France's high-speed rail network, and the Saclay hub in a single automated ride of around 30 minutes. A striking stretch of it runs on an elevated viaduct 14 kilometers long, lifting the trains above the flat plateau landscape rather than burying them. Like every Grand Paris Express line, Line 18 is fully driverless, running on a completely automated system with no one at the controls. The trains hit 100 kilometers per hour in testing, and at launch they'll run every 5 minutes at peak times, with room to add more as the crowds grow. Ridership on the line is projected to reach 118,000 passengers a day once it's fully built out. It hasn't all gone to plan. The first section was originally meant to open on October 1st, 2026, then slipped to the end of November. The stretch reaching Orly Airport won't open until 2027, and the western leg out to Versailles isn't due until 2030. But after years of tunneling, viaduct building, and testing beneath and above the southern suburbs, the first trains of Europe's biggest metro expansion finally start running this year. From France, we move across Europe to one of the most complex engineering marvels under the Alps, where Italy and Austria just met in the middle of a mountain. On July 28, 2026, deep under the Alps, miners finally broke through the last wall of rock separating Italy from Austria. 1,400 meters of solid mountain sat above them as the two sides connected for the first time. It was a moment more than a decade in the making, and it means the Brenner Base Tunnel, the longest railway tunnel in the world, is now physically joined end to end. The scale of this thing is hard to picture. When it opens, it will run 55 kilometers straight through the base of the mountains between Innsbruck in Austria and Fortezza in Italy, linked up with an existing bypass tunnel around Innsbruck. The continuous underground run stretches to 64 kilometers, longer than any rail tunnel ever built. It's actually two parallel tubes running side by side, with a third, smaller exploratory tunnel bored 12 meters beneath them, used to study the rock during construction and later for drainage and emergencies. The reason it exists sits on the surface, in the traffic. The Brenner Pass is one of the busiest freight corridors in all of Europe. Every year, more than 2.5 million trucks grind over the mountain pass, along with 14 million cars, hauling around 50 million tons of goods between northern and southern Europe. The existing railway follows a route laid out back in 1860, winding up a mountainside with slopes so steep that freight trains need 2 or 3 locomotives just to make the climb. It's slow, it's expensive, and it can't compete with the trucks. The whole point of the base tunnel is to run flat and straight through the mountain instead of over it, letting long freight trains roll through at speed and pulling a huge share of those trucks off the road. For passengers, the difference is just as dramatic. The trip between Fortezza and Innsbruck, which takes around 80 minutes today, will drop to about 25 once trains are running at up to 250 kilometers per hour. Building it has been brutal and slow. Planning began back in 1999, construction started in 2011, and the project has run around 16 years behind its original schedule, with the cost climbing to roughly 8.5 billion euros, some 2.5 billion over budget. At least 3 workers have died during construction. As of the July breakthrough, about 90% of the total excavation was done, with the rest of the digging, plus all the track, power, and signaling systems still to come. The tunnel isn't expected to actually open to trains until 2032. The mountain has been beaten. Finishing what's inside it will take another 6 years. Across the Atlantic, a line of similar size to Grand Paris Express took so long to finish that the city nearly gave up believing it ever would. Some mega projects are remembered for what they achieve. This one is remembered, at least for now, for how long it took. On February 8, 2026, after nearly 15 years of construction, Toronto finally opened Line 5, the Eglinton Crosstown. a light rail line that had become a running joke and a genuine source of anger across the city long before a single passenger boarded it. The line itself is a serious piece of transit. It runs 19 kilometers across the middle of Toronto, from Mount Dennis in the west to Kennedy in the east, with 25 stations and stops. More than 10 kilometers of it are buried in tunnel beneath Eglinton Avenue, with the rest running down the center of the road, connecting to Toronto's existing subway lines at several points. When it hits full service, it's expected to cut travel times along the corridor by up to 60% compared to the buses that crawled along Eglinton before it. Trains run every few minutes, and the whole thing is designed to move huge numbers of people across a part of the city that had been starved of rapid transit for decades. The problem was getting there. When the project was first proposed back in 2007, it was pitched at 33 kilometers for around 2.2 billion Canadian dollars, with an opening date of 2020. What followed became one of the most troubled megaprojects in Canadian history. Construction started in 2011, then came the delays, one after another, driven by contractor disputes, difficult ground conditions, and persistent problems getting the automatic train control system to work properly. 2020 slipped to 2021, then 2022, and then it became genuinely impossible to say when the thing would open at all. Business owners along Eglinton spent years trapped behind construction hoarding, some of them going under while they waited. By the time it opened, the price had ballooned past $12.8 billion, more than $1 billion over even the revised budget, and many times the original estimate. The anger was real enough that opposition politicians and city councilors called for a full public inquiry into what went wrong, demanding to know how a light rail line ended up costing this much and taking this long. The line opened quietly, with free rides on the first day, and a phased rollout to let staff work out the remaining problems, rather than the celebration a project this size might once have expected. And even now, it isn't finished. A second phase, a 9.2-kilometer westward extension toward the airport and Mississauga, is under construction and isn't due to open until 2031. Toronto got its crosstown in the end. It just took a decade and a half and more than triple the money to get it. Toronto isn't the only city whose subway dreams collided with reality. 2,000 miles south, Los Angeles has spent over a decade digging a subway under one of its most famous streets, and the people who live above it did everything they could to stop it. On May 8, 2026, Los Angeles opened a stretch of subway that a lot of powerful people spent years trying to kill. It's the first section of the D-Line extension, a 4-mile run beneath Wilshire Boulevard from Koreatown out to the edge of Beverly Hills, with 3 new stations along the way. For a city famous for its traffic, it's a small miracle. A rider can now go from Beverly Hills to downtown LA in about 20 minutes, a trip that can take well over an hour by car when Wilshire is jammed. The corridor it serves is one of the busiest in the entire region. Wilshire Boulevard cuts through Koreatown, the Miracle Mile, and some of the densest neighborhoods west of downtown, past the LA County Museum of Art and the tar pits, feeding tens of thousands of commuters toward the west side every day. Rapid transit under that street has been talked about for decades. Actually, building it turned into a fight. The city of Beverly Hills mounted one of the most expensive municipal legal campaigns in recent Southern California history to stop Metro from tunneling beneath Beverly Hills High School. The local school district sued in 2012, raising fears about methane gas, earthquakes, and even terrorism. The city filed its own lawsuit the next year. Officials ran a Stop the Purple Threat campaign and gathered thousands of petition signatures, urging the federal government to pull the project's funding. Metro fought through all of it, won the right to tunnel, and kept digging. The digging itself wasn't easy either. The tunnel boring machines hit pockets of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas beneath the old oil fields the route runs through, and at one point, workers had to climb into the machine and manually remove metal beams buried in the path with shovels. Cost overruns piled up, the Metro Board approving one after another, and the price of this first section climbed to around $3.5 billion. This is only the opening stretch. The full 9-mile extension will eventually push west through Beverly Hills and Century City all the way to Westwood and the VA hospital near UCLA, at a total cost approaching $9.5 billion. Metro is racing to get the whole thing done in time for the 2028 Olympics, when the world arrives in Los Angeles, and the city desperately wants to show it can move people without a car. The first 4 miles at least are finally open. Let's now move to structures that push engineering to the edge of what's physically possible. Built in places where it was impossible to build for centuries. And few places say that louder than a small island stranded in the middle of China's greatest river. In the middle of the Yangtze River, in China's Hubei province, sits Bailizhou, a river island that cut off an entire community from the mainland. This year, that finally changed. The Zhejiang Yangtze River Bridge reached across the water and connected Bailizhou to the road network for the first time in its history. For the people who live on the island, a crossing that used to take several hours by ferry now takes 5 minutes by car. The bridge is a serious piece of engineering in its own right. It stretches 1,549 meters across the Yangtze, carried on a main suspension span of 890 meters, tall enough and wide enough to let the heavy river traffic of one of the world's busiest inland waterways pass beneath it. The final piece of the deck was lifted into place on May 15, 2026, a single closure segment nearly 48 meters wide and weighing 148 tons, hoisted more than 100 meters above the river, and locked into position with millimeter precision. Engineers called it the most demanding phase of the entire build, joining the two halves of the bridge in mid-air over moving water. It's one link in a much larger expressway pushing through this part of Hubei, part of China's relentless, decades-long campaign to throw bridges across the Yangtze. The river has historically split the country in two, and China has spent years stitching it back together, one enormous crossing at a time, with dozens of bridges now spanning its length and more going up every year. For most of the country, the Zhejiang Bridge is just the newest of many. For the people of Bailizhou, it's the one that finally connected them to the rest of the world. 2026 is also a year of records set in the other direction, straight up. In 3 different countries, 3 buildings are topping out as the tallest of their kind, and the race to the top has never been more crowded. For decades, the tallest building in Texas stood in Houston. In 2026, that title moved to Austin. The Waterline Tower, rising in the middle of downtown Austin, reached its full height of 1,025 feet across 74 stories, overtaking Houston's J.P. Morgan Chase Tower, which had held the state record since 1981. It's a genuinely enormous building for a city Austin's size. Around 2.7 million square feet of space, roughly equivalent to 47 football fields stacked into a single tower, wrapped around 3 distinct uses. The lower floors hold office space, the middle floors a 251-room hotel, and the top 33 floors are given over to 351 luxury apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city, Waller Creek, and Lady Bird Lake. A ride to the top takes about 45 seconds. The tower reflects how fast Austin has grown. Over the last decade, the city has pulled in tech companies, workers, and money at a pace that reshaped its skyline, and Waterline is the loudest statement of that transformation. Designed by the architecture firm Kohn Pedersen Fox, it broke ground in 2022 and topped out in the summer of 2025, with more than 4,750 workers passing through the site over the course of construction. It opens in phases through late 2026, starting with the hotel. Almost fittingly for a boomtown, Waterline wasn't even supposed to hold the crown. Another Austin tower, the planned Wilson Tower, was meant to rise higher, but its developer scaled it back sharply as construction costs and interest rates climbed, handing Waterline the title of tallest in Texas almost by default. 2,000 miles northeast, on the most famous street in the world, a far skinnier tower is reaching a similar height. There is no more famous street in the world than Fifth Avenue, and in 2026, it got a new giant, 520 Fifth Avenue, on the corner of 43rd Street in Midtown Manhattan, topped out at 1,002 feet across 88 stories, becoming the tallest residential building on Fifth Avenue and the second tallest structure on the entire street, behind only the Empire State Building a few blocks south. What makes the building remarkable isn't just its height, it's how thin it is. 525th has a slenderness ratio of roughly 1 to 12, meaning it's 12 times as tall as it is wide, making it one of the skinniest skyscrapers in a city increasingly full of them. From certain angles, it reads almost like a needle. The design, again by Kohn Pedersen Fox, deliberately nods to the old Beaux-Arts landmarks nearby, with a facade of glazed terracotta arches framing enormous 10-foot by 10-foot windows, tiered setbacks stepping the tower inward as it climbs. Inside, the lower floors hold boutique office space, and above the 42nd floor sit 100 luxury condominiums. The building sold through more than 95% of those condos in under a year, an unusually fast pace even for Manhattan's ultra-luxury market. Construction started in 2022, and the tower is finishing up in mid-2026, adding one more spire to a midtown skyline that never stops growing taller and thinner. Across the border, Toronto is building its own super tall, and it is the tallest thing the country has ever seen. Toronto has the third largest skyline in North America, behind only New York and Chicago, and in 2026, it crowned that skyline with the tallest building in Canada. Sky Tower, at the foot of Yonge Street near Toronto's waterfront, topped out at 106 stories and 352 meters, roughly 1,154 feet, making it the tallest building in Canada and one of the country's first true super talls. To put its height in perspective, the top floors of Sky Tower sit roughly eye level with the main observation deck of the CN Tower, the landmark that has defined Toronto's skyline since the 1970s. It's the first residential building in North America to reach 106 stories. Designed to look like a 12-sided jewel rising out of its base, the tower holds nearly 960 luxury condominiums stacked above a 220-room Le Méridien Hotel occupying the lower floors, plus around 80,000 square feet of amenities. Sky Tower is only the second of 5 towers planned for the Pinnacle One Yonge development, a 4.4 million square foot community being built on the site of the former Toronto Star Building. Construction began in late 2020, and the building tops out and reaches occupancy through 2026. A third tower on the site is planned to rise 95 stories, meaning Toronto's skyline, already the tallest in the country, isn't finished climbing yet. Toronto's record stood for a country with a long high-rise history. The next tower set a record for an entire continent, and it took half a century of waiting to get there. In 2026, Africa's tallest building was completed, and it wasn't in Cairo, Lagos, or Nairobi. It rose in Abidjan, the economic capital of Côte d'Ivoire, and it had been coming for more than 50 years. Tower F climbs to 421 meters, around 1,381 feet, counting its spire, overtaking Egypt's iconic tower to become the tallest building on the continent. The idea goes back to the 1970s. Abidjan's government district already had 5 administrative towers, lettered A through E, built by the early 1980s. Tower F was meant to be the 6th. Then it stalled, and it stayed stalled for decades. Financing dried up, political instability set in, including 2 civil wars in 2002 and 2010 that made a super tall office tower an impossible priority. The plan never quite died, but it waited, a blank space in the skyline for an entire generation. Construction finally resumed and broke ground in 2021. The finished building is designed to mean something. Its faceted glass facade is shaped to evoke a stylized African mask, with 2 symmetrical faces tapering inward toward the crown, the work of Lebanese Ivorian architect Pierre Fakouri, the same designer behind the vast Notre Dame de la Paix Basilica in Yamoussoukro. At the very top sits a glass lantern around 30 meters tall, meant to open to the public with a 360-degree view over the city and the Ebrié Lagoon below. Across roughly 75 floors, the tower is built to pull government ministries currently scattered across Abidjan into a single headquarters at an estimated cost of around 450 million euros. There's a message in it too, aimed squarely at the outside world. A super tall tower finishing in Abidjan is a statement to investors that Côte d'Ivoire has moved past the instability of its recent history and is open for business. not everyone is convinced, and some architecture critics have questioned whether Africa's growing cluster of supertalls reflects real demand or national pride. But after 50 years on the drawing board, Tower F is finally real, and the continent has a new high point. Everything so far has been built on the ground: airports, bridges, canals, towers reaching into the sky. But some of the most ambitious projects, finishing in 2026, don't stop at the edge of the atmosphere. This year, humans flew back to the moon, a telescope launch that can map the sky faster than anything before it, and a bomber built to be invisible rolled towards service. For more than 50 years, no human being had traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The last people to fly to the moon came home in 1972. Every astronaut since had circled a few hundred kilometers above the planet, and no further. In the spring of 2026, that finally changed. On April 1st, 2026, 4 astronauts launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on top of NASA's Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket ever flown, which produced 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. NASA's Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, along with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, were sealed inside the Orion spacecraft for a mission called Artemis II, a roughly 10-day flight around the moon and back. There was no landing planned. The goal was simpler, and in its way, just as historic: loop out around the far side of the moon, test every system that a future landing would depend on, and bring the crew home safely. The mission cost was staggering. The Artemis program had run to roughly $93 billion, and everything about the hardware was enormous. The SLS rocket stands taller than the Statue of Liberty. The Orion capsule was pushed further into space than any spacecraft built to carry humans ever had. The flight itself was close to flawless. After launch, Orion swung out on a path that carried the crew around the far side of the moon, passing about 4,067 miles above the lunar surface at closest approach. On April 6th, they crossed a threshold no one had reached in over half a century, traveling 252,756 miles from Earth, breaking the record for the farthest humans have ever been from the planet, a mark that had stood since Apollo 13 in 1970. They watched Earth shrink to a marble behind them, photographed the far side of the moon, and even placed the first ever call between a crewed moon mission and the astronauts aboard the International Space Station. On April 10th, 2026, Orion tore back into the atmosphere at tremendous speed, its heat shield, which had known design flaws going in, holding through the fire of re-entry, and the capsule splashed down in the Pacific off the coast of San Diego. The 4 astronauts emerged safe. Artemis II had done exactly what it set out to do, and it cleared the way for Artemis III, the mission that aims to put humans back on the surface of the moon for the first time since the Apollo era. Artemis sent humans back toward the moon to look outward. A few months later, from the same stretch of Florida coast, NASA launched something built to look far, far deeper into the universe and to see more of it at once than anything before it. On August 30th, 2026, NASA launched its next Great Space Observatory from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, riding a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket into space. It's called the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, named after NASA's first chief astronomer, the woman who championed the Hubble telescope decades before it was ever built, earning her the nickname the Mother of Hubble. And the telescope carrying her name is designed to do something Hubble never could: see enormous swaths of the sky all at once. Here's the detail that captures it. Roman carries a 2.4-meter mirror, exactly the same size as Hubble's, but its 300-megapixel camera captures a patch of sky at least 100 times larger in a single shot. Where Hubble would need 100 separate images to cover a region of the sky, Roman does it in one. Put another way, it can see in a single exposure what would take Hubble years of pointing and stitching to assemble. It's not built to zoom in deeper than Hubble or the James Webb Telescope. It's built for breadth, to sweep across the heavens and map them at a speed no telescope has ever managed. That wide view is aimed at some of the biggest unanswered questions in science. Roman will measure the shapes and distances of billions of galaxies to map how dark energy, the mysterious force driving the accelerating expansion of the universe, actually behaves. It carries a special instrument called a coronagraph that can block out the blinding light of distant stars to photograph the planets orbiting them directly. And it's expected to discover thousands of new exoplanets while building the deepest wide-field time-lapse of the cosmos ever made. The observatory cost around $4.3 billion over its lifetime, and remarkably, it reached the launch pad months ahead of its official schedule, a rarity for a project of this complexity. Roman is designed to work as a team with the telescopes already up there. Because it sweeps such vast areas of sky, it acts as a scout, flagging strange and interesting objects, an ancient galaxy, an odd supernova, a chaotic planetary system, and logging exactly where they are. Then, the James Webb Telescope, with its narrow but incredibly deep vision, can be pointed at those precise coordinates to study them in detail. And unlike some missions, all of Roman's data will be open to anyone, from university researchers to a curious teenager with a laptop. It could reshape astronomy for decades. Space is one frontier where 2026 pushed the limits. The other is far closer to the ground, cloaked in secrecy and built not to explore, but to remain unseen. Most enormous American weapons programs eventually become bywords for cost overruns. The F-35 fighter's lifetime cost is now projected above $2 trillion, the most expensive weapons program ever fielded. The B-21 Raider was supposed to be the next one. Instead, in 2026, it did something almost unheard of in defense. It stayed on schedule and on budget while quietly becoming the most advanced combat aircraft on Earth. The B-21 is a stealth bomber, the first new one America has built in more than 3 decades, designed to slip through the most advanced air defenses in the world and strike anywhere on the planet while remaining effectively invisible to radar. It's the successor to the B-2 Spirit, the iconic flying wing bomber of the 1990s, and it's meant to be far cheaper and far harder to detect. Northrop Grumman builds it at its plant in Palmdale, California, under enormous secrecy, and its exact capabilities are among the most classified in the American arsenal. Each aircraft costs around $692 million, and the whole program covering development, a fleet of at least 100 aircraft and 30 years of operations, is pegged at roughly $203 billion. What makes 2026 the Raiders' breakout year is how fast everything moved. The program had 2 aircraft flying test missions over the Mojave Desert, sometimes up to twice a week, and the test force completed a planned 180-day evaluation campaign in just 73 days. Operational pilots, not just test pilots, began flying it. In February 2026, the Air Force and Northrop signed an agreement backed by $4.5 billion to accelerate production and raise output by 25%. Meanwhile, at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, the first operational home of the B-21, construction crews spent 2026 racing to finish the runways, hangars, and infrastructure needed to receive it. Work so extensive, the base's existing bombers had to temporarily relocate. The reason it's held its costs where so many others haven't comes down to a few deliberate choices. The very first test aircraft was built to full production standard on the same line with the same tools as the finished bombers, rather than as a one-off experimental model. So lessons from testing flow straight into manufacturing, and Northrop absorbs the overruns itself under the terms of its contract. The first combat-ready Raiders are due to arrive at Ellsworth in 2027, but 2026 was the year the program proved it could actually be done, on time and on budget, in a field where that almost never happens. Rockets, telescopes, and bombers push the limits of what's possible, but not every landmark finishing in 2026 is about power or reach. Some are about beauty, spectacle, and the simple pull of a place people gather. And a few of them have been lifetimes in the making. On October 17, 2026, Shanghai opens one of the most dramatic cultural buildings on the planet, and its most striking feature is a roof you can walk on. The Shanghai Grand Opera House sits on the convex bank of the Huangpu River, the same waterway that curves through the heart of the city in a riverside district called Hotan that has been rebuilt as a low-carbon ecological neighborhood since the 2010 World Expo. From a distance, the building reads as a single sweeping white gesture, a roof that spirals upward like an unfolding fan. That spiral is the whole idea. Designed by the Norwegian firm Snøhetta, the helical roof is meant to capture the movement of a dancer, and rather than seal it off, the architects turned it into public space. A staircase winds up the outside of the roof to an observation deck at the very top, open 24 hours a day, every day of the year, whether or not you ever set foot inside for a performance. It's a trick Snøhetta has pulled before, most famously at the Oslo Opera House, where the roof became a walkable public plaza. In Shanghai, they've taken the same idea and spun it into the sky, so the building becomes a piece of the city that anyone can climb for a view over the river and the skyline. Underneath that roof sit 3 separate performance venues. The centerpiece is a 2,000-seat main auditorium, tuned by the specialists at Nagata Acoustics, the same firm behind some of the finest concert halls in the world, to meet international standards for opera and large-scale productions. A second hall seats 1,200 for more intimate shows, and a third, a 1,000-seat flexible theater, is built for experimental work aimed at drawing in younger audiences who might never have gone to an opera otherwise. The white exterior gives way to a softer interior lined in oak, with the walls of the main hall stained a deep dark red. The whole building covers nearly 147,000 square meters. The project began with an international design competition that Snøhetta won back in 2016, with the firm formally commissioned in 2019 to see it through from concept to completion. Construction wrapped in June 2026, and the opening season is a statement of ambition in itself. 82 performances across 47 productions, mixing traditional Chinese opera with Western opera, classical concerts, and modern work. It's the anchor of a much larger plan to establish Shanghai not just as China's financial capital, but as one of the world's genuine centers of culture. A building designed from the ground up to belong to the public as much as to the people holding tickets. Shanghai's Opera House took about a decade to complete. On the coast of the Persian Gulf, another cultural landmark took twice as long and cost far more, sitting half-built in the desert for years, while the world wondered if it would ever open at all. On December 11, 2026, the largest Guggenheim museum in the world opens on the coast of Abu Dhabi, and it arrives 20 full years after it was first announced. It's the final major work of Frank Gehry, the architect who rewrote the rules of what a museum could be with the Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain back in 1997, a building so influential that city planners coined a term, the Bilbao effect, to describe how a single piece of architecture could put a city on the map. In Abu Dhabi, Gehry got to do it one last time, at a far bigger scale, in one of the harshest building climates on Earth. The building looks like nothing else in the Guggenheim family. Gehry wrapped it in a cluster of 10 enormous sculptural cones, 9 of them clad in stainless steel mesh, and 1 in a mix of onyx and glass, rising as high as 88 meters and forming a jagged, irregular skyline that's visible clear across Saadiyat Island. Those cones aren't just Gehry's usual restless geometry. In the brutal heat of the Gulf, where summer temperatures routinely climb past 40 degrees Celsius, they work as passive cooling towers, funneling shade and natural ventilation down into the building so it doesn't have to lean entirely on air conditioning. It's Gehry's signature style bent to the demands of the desert. Inside, 30 galleries of wildly different shapes and ceiling heights wrap around a soaring central atrium, joined by a center for art and technology, a conservation lab, a library, and children's facilities. At roughly 80,000 square meters, it dwarfs the original spiral Guggenheim in New York and the outposts in Venice and Bilbao. The collection is built to tell a deliberately global story rather than a Western one, focusing on modern and contemporary art from West Asia, North Africa, and South Asia from 1960 onward, with more than 600 works already acquired and names like Yayoi Kusama and Barty Kerr among them. Getting here was a 2-decade ordeal. The museum was announced in 2006. Construction began in 2011, then stalled and sat frozen for years amid the global financial crisis, economic strain, and disputes over contracts, to the point where its own leadership at times wondered aloud whether it would ever be built. Work finally resumed in 2019, and even then the opening slipped from a planned 2025 into the final weeks of 2026. The reported cost is around $1 billion. It's the crown of the Saadiyat Cultural District, an extraordinary cluster of museums Abu Dhabi has assembled on one island alongside the Louvre Abu Dhabi and the Zayed National Museum, part of the Emirates' bet that it can turn itself into a global capital of culture. After 20 years, Gary's last great building is finally standing. Abu Dhabi built its museum to import the art of the world. On the other side of the planet in Los Angeles, one man spent $1 billion of his own money to build something aesthetically different. On September 22, 2026, a building that looks like it landed from another galaxy opens in Los Angeles. The Lucas Museum of Narrative Art in Exposition Park, just southwest of downtown, is a low, sweeping, silver structure that has drawn endless comparisons to a spaceship settling onto the grass, and it exists for one simple reason. George Lucas, the filmmaker behind Star Wars and Indiana Jones, decided to build it and pay for the entire thing out of his own pocket. The mission behind it is a kind of argument. Lucas set out to build a museum for narrative art, the illustration, comics, film design, and storytelling images that traditional art institutions have often dismissed as commercial or lowbrow. His position is the opposite, that this is the people's art, the imagery ordinary lives are actually built around, and that it belongs in a museum as much as anything hanging in a fine art gallery. The permanent collection runs to more than 40,000 works, ranging from Norman Rockwell and N.C. Wyeth to comic book legend Jack Kirby, fantasy painter Frank Frazetta, Beatrix Potter, Maxfield Parrish, and Frida Kahlo, alongside archival material from Lucas's own films. Inside, 35 galleries spread across roughly 300,000 square feet and 5 floors, with the galleries named not for movements or periods, but for human themes: love, family, community, work, play, and sport, wrapped in around 11 acres of landscaped gardens. The building itself is the work of Ma Yansong of the Chinese firm Mad Architects, who has said the design was inspired by the landscapes of myths and movies, meant to carry visitors on a journey through space. It curves and floats above the ground, unlike any museum around it, closer to a piece of science fiction than a conventional gallery. The road to opening day was long and, at times, humiliating. Lucas first pitched the museum more than a decade ago, and it was rejected by 2 cities before it found a home. San Francisco turned it down over its waterfront site. Chicago fought it through the courts until Lucas finally abandoned the effort there. Los Angeles at last welcomed it, and construction began in Exposition Park in 2018, next to the Coliseum and the Natural History Museum. Over those 13 years, the budget climbed from around $700 million to a reported $1 billion. Every cent of it funded personally by Lucas, including the building, the art, and an endowment of at least $400 million to keep the doors open for good. For a man who spent his career telling stories on a screen, the museum is a final argument that the pictures behind those stories deserve a place among the world's great art. In 2026, 2 of the most storied names in sport opened new homes, starting in one of the coldest corners of American football. Most cold-weather cities in professional sports eventually build a dome. Buffalo did the opposite. When the Buffalo Bills opened their new Highmark Stadium for the 2026 NFL season, they built it open to the sky on purpose, in a place that averages more than 90 inches of snow a year, the snowiest venue in the history of the league. The owners were clear from the start: no roof, no bubble, no climate control. Buffalo football is supposed to be played in Buffalo weather. miserable for the visiting team and a badge of honor for the home crowd. That single decision shaped the entire building. Designed by the architecture firm Populous and built directly across the street from the old stadium the Bills had called home since 1973, the new venue cost more than $2.1 billion, making it the most expensive construction project in the history of Western New York. Rather than enclose it, the engineers wrapped a 360-degree canopy around the bowl that shelters roughly 64% of the seats, while deliberately leaving the field itself open to the snow. The canopy does double duty, trapping crowd noise to make the stadium one of the loudest in the NFL, and it hides a genuinely wild piece of engineering. Sensors on the roof automatically detect snow buildup and trigger a heated system to melt it away, what the Bills describe as the largest stadium snowmelt system in the world, there to keep the canopy from collapsing under the weight of a Buffalo storm. The field is natural grass again, a return from artificial turf, kept alive through the long winters by underground heating coils and grow lights beneath the surface. The seating is steeper and closer to the action than the old bowl, with fans in the front row 54 feet near the field, all in service of a louder, more intense atmosphere. Interestingly, the new stadium is smaller than the one it replaces, holding 60,108 fans, around 11,000 fewer than the old Highmark, a deliberate bet that a tighter, steeper, louder bowl beats a cavernous one. Ground broke in June 2023. The ribbon was cut in June 2026, and the stadium hosts its first regular season game on September 17, 2026, against the Detroit Lions on Thursday Night Football. The old stadium across the street, home to more than half a century of Bills history, including the greatest comeback in NFL playoff history, is set to be demolished in 2027. Buffalo built its future without pretending it lives anywhere other than Buffalo. Buffalo built its new home from scratch, right across the street from the old one. In Barcelona, a club took the opposite approach. Rather than abandon the most famous stadium in Europe, it decided to tear the thing apart and rebuild it from the inside while the team kept playing. Camp Nou has been the largest stadium in Europe for almost its entire life. When it opened in Barcelona in 1957, it held over 106,000 people, and for generations, it was the beating heart of FC Barcelona, the ground where Cruyff, Ronaldinho, and Messi played some of the greatest football ever seen. By the 2020s, though, the concrete giant was aging, and the club committed to the most dramatic rebuild in its history, a project called Espai Barça that would gut and modernize the stadium without moving the club anywhere permanent. The plan is enormous. When it's finished, Camp Nou will hold around 105,000 fans, keeping its crown as the biggest stadium in Europe with a completely new third tier of seating, a full 360-degree roof covered in solar panels, more than 9,000 VIP seats, and a modernized facade. The overall Espai Barça program, which also upgrades the club's other facilities, is financed by a credit line of around 1.45 billion euros. The idea is to preserve the soul of the old ground while turning it into one of the most profitable stadiums in world sport, capable of generating close to 350 million euros a year once fully operational. Pulling it off has been messy. Construction began in 2022 and full swing arrived in 2023 when the team moved out entirely, spending 2 seasons playing across the city at Barcelona's Olympic Stadium on Montjuic, a ground with roughly 40,000 fewer seats. The renovation has run more than a year behind schedule and pushed well past €1 billion with major stages still to go, forcing the club to lean on additional financing to cover the overruns. There was real pressure to get fans back in the door too, tied partly to the naming rights deal with the streaming company Spotify, which required a full return to the stadium to protect its value. Tragically, the building site also claimed the life of a worker during construction. Barcelona finally returned to Camp Nou in November 2025 after 906 days away, playing in a partially reopened ground as the work continued around them. Through 2026, the capacity has climbed in stages as more of the rebuilt stadium comes online, past 62,000 by the middle of the year, on the way to that final 6-figure target. The full completion with the third tier and the new roof finished, has slipped to 2027. But for the first time in years, the most famous club stadium in Europe is alive again, being rebuilt around the fans even as they fill it. Stadiums, museums, towers, airports, almost everything finishing in 2026 is something you can walk into. The projects that close out this list are different. One powers millions of homes from the middle of the sea. One is the fastest train on Earth. And one has been under construction for nearly a century and a half. We start out in the North Sea. More than 130 kilometers off the coast of Yorkshire, in a rough, shallow stretch of the North Sea, sits the largest offshore wind farm ever built. Dogger Bank is so far out that the turbines are well over the horizon, invisible from any shoreline, planted in open water where the wind rarely stops blowing. In 2026, after years of construction in one of the harshest marine environments in Europe, it reaches full power. The scale is genuinely hard to picture. Dogger Bank is built across 3 phases, A, B, and C, adding up to a combined capacity of 3.6 gigawatts, enough to power around 6 million British homes, roughly 5% of the entire United Kingdom's electricity demand from a single project. It uses 277 of the largest offshore wind turbines in commercial operation, machines so big that a single blade stretches over 100 meters and the tip of a turning turbine reaches nearly 280 meters into the sky, taller than almost any building in Britain. It was also the first project in the UK to use high-voltage direct current to carry the power all the way back to shore, a technology needed because the farm sits so far out to sea. Building it was a slog. The developers, a joint venture led by Britain's SSE and Norway's Equinor, took the final investment decision back in 2020, and the total cost climbed toward £9 billion. Turbine installation started in 2023, and the first phase delivered power that October. Then the setbacks came. Brutal North Sea weather repeatedly halted work. Turbine blades were damaged in separate incidents. A fire broke out at an offshore substation in 2023 that knocked out equipment and exposed how vulnerable the whole system was to a single point of failure. Those problems pushed the original 2025 completion date back into 2026. By early that year, the last of the foundations and turbines were finally going in, putting the full 3.6 gigawatt complex on track to come fully online. Dogger Bank matters beyond the electricity it produces. It's the proof of concept for building clean power at genuinely massive scale, a template for the wind farms meant to follow it across the North Sea, and a cornerstone of Britain's plan to wean itself off imported gas and onto homegrown energy. There's even a planned 4th phase waiting in the wings. For now, the biggest wind farm on Earth is spinning up in open water, quietly generating enough power for millions of homes that will never see it. From power at scale, let's move to sheer speed with the fastest train ever put on rails for passengers. China already runs the largest and fastest high-speed rail network on Earth, more than 50,000 kilometers of track, more than the rest of the world combined. Its current bullet trains cruise at 350 kilometers per hour. In 2026, the country moves the bar again with the CR450, a train built to run in normal passenger service at 400 kilometers per hour, making it the fastest scheduled train in the world by a comfortable margin. The numbers behind it are hard to believe. In pre-service trials on the line between Shanghai and Chengdu in late 2025, the CR450 hit 453 kilometers per hour, a world record for a conventional wheels-on-rails train. It can accelerate from a standstill to 350 kilometers per hour in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. And in one test, 2 CR450 trains passed each other at a combined closing speed of 896 kilometers per hour. At those speeds, air resistance becomes the enemy, so engineers reshape the train from the ground up. Compared to the previous generation, the CR450 has a longer, sleeker nose, a roofline lowered by 20 centimeters, and it sheds 50 tons of weight, cutting aerodynamic drag by 22%. It carries a new permanent magnet propulsion system and more than 4,000 onboard sensors constantly monitoring its own performance and safety. What that speed actually buys is time. On the flagship Beijing to Shanghai corridor, the busiest and most symbolic line in the country, the CR450 could cut the journey to as little as 2.5 hours. The whole point is to make the train genuinely faster than flying once you account for airports and security, pulling travelers off short-haul flights and onto rail for the 1,000-kilometer trips that crisscross China every day. There's a catch worth being honest about. Before it can carry a single paying passenger, the CR450 has to complete 600,000 kilometers of successful trial running, and some existing tracks and signaling systems need upgrades to safely handle 400 km/h service. Chinese state media called the final round of testing the last step before commercial operation, describing it as a leap from "made in China" to "created in China." The design was signed off in 2026, with the first passengers expected to climb aboard as the rollout begins. When they do, they'll be riding the fastest train the world has ever put into scheduled service. The CR450 took a handful of years to build. The last project on this list took a little longer, 144 years to be exact. In 1882, construction began on a church in Barcelona. In 2026, it finally reached the sky. The Sagrada Família, the impossibly intricate basilica designed by the Catalan architect Antoni Gaudí, has been under construction for 144 years, long enough to become the most famous unfinished building in the world. Its towers wrapped in cranes and scaffolding for the entire living memory of the city around it. This year, the cranes started coming down. On February 20th, 2026, workers installed the final piece of the Tower of Jesus Christ, the central spire that crowns the entire basilica, bringing it to its full height of 172.5 meters, roughly 566 feet. With that, the Sagrada Família became the tallest church in the world. The height is no accident. Gaudí deliberately designed his tower to stand just under 173 meters, half a meter shorter than Montjuïc, the natural hill that is the high point of Barcelona, because he believed a human creation should never rise higher than the work of God. The tower is topped by a vast cross, as tall as a 5-story building and weighing around 100 tons, manufactured in Germany in 14 sections and lifted into place piece by piece, more than 60 meters above the nave. The road here spanned 3 centuries and survived nearly everything. Gaudí took over the project in 1883 and spent the last decades of his life consumed by it, famously shrugging off the glacial pace with the line, "My client is in no hurry." He was killed by a tram in 1926 with the basilica barely a quarter finished. Construction crawled onward through the Spanish Civil War, which saw parts of Gaudí's original plans and models destroyed. Through decades of funding shortfalls, political upheaval, and the sheer impossibility of building something this complex, 11 different popes have reigned since the first stone was laid. In June 2026, on the exact centenary of Gaudí's death, Pope Leo XIV led a mass to inaugurate the completed tower. The building still isn't entirely done. Decorative work and the grand glory facade are expected to continue into the 2030s. But after 144 years, the structure Gaudí dreamed of is finally standing at its full height over Barcelona, the culmination of one of the longest construction projects in human history. Some of these projects took a handful of years, some took decades, and one took nearly a century and a half. All of them are reaching the most significant milestones in 2026. But which one impressed you the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, check out our compilation of the biggest mega project in every US state. Keep following SIGNUM, and we will see you in the next video.